name is Jeffrey Nice, by the way. Context of law events aim to have the very large bank of knowledge, wisdom, and so on of the Inns of Court put to discussing contemporary issues, not just for students, not just for members of the Inn and judges, but also for the public. And tonight's topic is one that has long required open and daring debate. For what it's worth, my inclination from conducting many criminal trials for most of 5 decades has been to wonder how civilized societies are so approving of using lock up as opposed to lock down as a means of regulation. I wait to learn more from our speakers, but they will be introduced not by me, but by our moderator, Libby Purves. But first, I have to tell you that the lecture is being recorded and will appear on the Inner Temple website in the coming days. A link will be sent to all of those attending afterwards. Please use the Q&A function button for questions. They will then be put to the panel at the end of the discussion by honorary bencher, as she is, Libby Purves, OBE. We are scheduled to finish at 7 p.m. A word about broadcaster, author, and speaker Libby Purves, a regular on-stage interviewer for the Royal Geographical Society, the first female presenter of Radio 4's Today programme, who went on to present The Learning Curve and Midweek for many years. Founder of theatrecat.com, an online theatre review website, and a regular contributor to the Radio Times and the Times newspaper, she was elected as honorary bencher of our Inn into the Inner Temple in 2012. Libby, over to you.
Good evening. Our two speakers this evening have got between them a most admirable experience of prison from every possible side, from the very top down and from inside and out. Jonathan Aitken, of course, has been an MP and a cabinet minister and has himself served time. He's written about it and he's authored reports for the Centre for Social Justice on prison reform. And most importantly, of course, right now, Jonathan is a prison chaplain at Pentonville and honorary chaplain to Christians in government. Daw Qc is the author of Justice on Trial, a challenging book I've been greatly enjoying in an alarmed sort of way, laying out where we fail and have been failing for many years in prison policy and prison facts. He is, of course, a leading criminal defence barrister and has looked into the faces of people most of us would shy away from, people of every generation, and has listened to arguments in real life which would raise eyebrows in disbelief if they turned up on a television play. Chris knows, like any of us who visit prisons quite regularly, that sense of, as he writes in the book, waiting patiently as keys slide into locks, heavy metallic doors swing open and then shut, one after the other. I feel that to hear both these voices tonight is going to be a privilege, and to hear them in discussion and to be able to question them, which I hope some good questions will arise to each. They tossed a coin, or it may have been a bunch of keys, to see who would speak first. And it is going to be Daw Qc. Sir, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Libby, and good evening, everybody. It's an honour to have been invited by Inner Temple, not least as a member of Gray's Inn. It's incredibly kind of Inner Temple to allow me through the virtual door at all. So I had a text message from my 14-year-old daughter yesterday to say that she had completed a careers test online, and somewhat miraculously, in my view, it had told her that law might be the path for her, and there's a continuation in that particular story, because some of you may have seen that I made a short film for the BBC a couple of years ago about my own journey from a comprehensive school in Milton Keynes to a career in law, and I took a rudimentary computer careers test in 1986, I think it was, and exactly the same thing popped up. I was told that there were only really two careers for me. One was as an actor and the other as a barrister, and a career, I can tell you, which was not a common choice amongst my peers at that particular school. Then or now, sadly, having been back there and spoken there recently. But my daughter also, having come to this realization or this piece of information from the computer that she was looking at yesterday, decided for the very first time that she would start reading my book, which was published some six or so months ago now, and she hadn't managed to pick it up off of the shelf. But she did, and she read the introduction, and she has found it interesting. And I'm glad about that, because for me, our criminal justice system and the way we deal with criminal acts and criminal activity as a society is not only a very important part of our civil society, but it's also, I think, across the piece, probably the one that we get the most wrong. And it was for that reason, having been in practice for now 26, coming up to 27 years, almost as long as Jeffrey, but not quite. I came to the conclusion, that everything I'd been doing throughout that period of time in my career was pretty much contributing to a negative outcome. So that when I go to court, of course, as a lawyer, I am duty bound to do the best I can for my client, to follow my instructions, and of course to assist the court and assist the administration of justice. But I was asked time and again, I asked myself, what's the point of this case? And the way in which I'm kind of trying to use my time, and I think we've sort of a 10-minute in total introduction, of which I've already had a fairly long run up to the wicket, is really to try and justify why I came to the conclusion that my own working life, fascinating though it's been, rewarding though it's been in many ways, and you cannot, I know many of you who are watching this transmission or this stream are either student lawyers or practicing lawyers, and you obviously must therefore have a passion for law and a passion for practice. And certainly, by way of encouragement, I can tell you, and I'm sure the lawyers on this stream would agree, it's one of the most, if not the most fascinating way to spend your working life. The subject matter is intrinsically interesting. The day-to-day work that we do challenges in so many ways. But for all of that, what's it for? And it was coming to that conclusion that I really thought that most of it was a waste of time in the broader sense for our society, that I decided a couple of years ago to write my book, which, as you can see from the name, was intended to put justice on trial. I asked myself through the writing of the book, what's the point of it? So I thought I'd use my time to give you the whole book in what's probably now about 5 or 6 minutes, because I tried to tick all of the different boxes, all of the different, the central planks, as it were, of our criminal justice system, and explain in the book why they are all so dysfunctional. And I start the book by talking about the history of crime and punishment. And the history of crime and punishment, of course, goes back many, many years, of civilizations, the Mayans and so on. And I go right the way through in the book, through the Romans, and it's a fairly brief trot because it's not a particularly thick book. But one of the things that marked out systems of justice in those early societies was, of course, this idea of vengeance and punishment. And that marked out that incredibly religious perception, and by religious I mean it in the most general sense, not related to any specific religion, but that moralistic and religious view that punishment and vengeance should be an intrinsic aim in its own self is something that marked out those systems tens of thousands of years ago and thousands of years ago. And sadly, as I followed the history through, and I learned a lot in researching the book that I didn't already know, those core themes of vengeance and punishment have pervaded almost every system of justice ever since, and they still do now. And they still do in the sense that we have seen in this country over the last 2 or 3 decades, when I've been in legal practice, an enormous increase in the use of imprisonment in particular the length of sentences and the number of prisoners. And much of that has been in response to public demand for vengeance and punishment for particular categories of offenders, particularly violent offenders, but also, as I'll come to in a moment, in terms of the increase in sentence lengths, drug offenders, which has seen one of the very largest increases of any kind of crime in the length of sentences imposed. So having, as it were, brought all of that perspective, I begin the book properly, as it were, with the subject of prison, of which, of course, I will concede that Jonathan, in more ways than one, has a great deal more experience than I do. But prisons, and I've been to dozens of prisons, in fact, not just in Britain, but all over the world. I travelled for the purpose of researching the book, and in particular was struck by the prison conditions in Alabama, which I describe in some detail, which are frankly so appalling and so contrary to any notion that I have of a civilized society, that they must call into question what the Americans are doing, but also in many ways what we're doing in this country. And the conclusion I came to and have come to about prisons, having traveled, as I say, and having researched the subject in some detail, is that they are almost entirely unfit for purpose. If the purpose of the criminal justice system is to reduce the amount of crime, to reduce the amount of repeat offending by those who commit crimes, then prison is diametrically the opposite policy and strategy that you would use if you were applying the evidence of what works and what doesn't work. And that's even if you set aside the inhumane way in which so many in prisons all over the world are treated by the establishments and by the system in which they are incarcerated. So prisons just don't work, to contradict one of Jonathan's former colleagues, Michael Howard, of some years ago. But another thing that doesn't work, and I describe in going back even further in the book, the history of drug consumption and drug prohibition. I think the earliest, from recollection I go back, is something like 20 million years ago, where there is evidence of the co-evolution of early hominid species and psychotropic plants. So our very, very distant ancestors were consuming psychotropic plants in a co-evolutionary manner tens and tens of millions of years ago. And as it doesn't take much knowledge of the world to know that so it is today. Millions and millions of people all over the world consume drugs of one kind or another, whether they're psychotropic or otherwise. And it is only really in the last 50 years or so that we have beginning in the US and beginning in the UK, to treat that activity as something that should be one of the most important elements of our criminal justice system and one of the most important sources of prisoners for the prison system. And I point out in the book, having again researched and traveled all over the world, but also represented people in many very substantial drugs cases, including cases where the supply chain was hundreds of millions of pounds worth of drugs from single conspiracies and single operations. All of that enforcement activity, all of those draconian sentences. I have had clients serving 28-year sentences for drugs offences, and indeed I had one client who was serving 40 years. 40-year sentence for drug offences alone, nothing else. And all I have ever seen across all of that criminal justice enforcement activity and all of those prosecutions is a dramatic increase in drug consumption, a reduction in the cost of drugs on the streets, and an enormous increase in drug-related violence and murder, not just on the streets of London and Manchester and Birmingham, but obviously on the streets of Mexico and Colombia and various other countries, of course, the United States, all over the world. All of it, in my conclusion, as a result of the prohibition that we've engaged in and the enforcement and lengthy prison sentences that follow for drug offences. So drugs, in my view, prohibition of drugs, I have no doubt whatsoever, based on the evidence and my experience, that prohibition is damaging and wrong for our society. The final two topics are kind of interlinked, and I'll deal with them very briefly. And the first of these is that one of the chapters of the book is called Why Children Are Never Criminals. And I have no doubt, once again, that the way we treat young people, particularly children from the age of 10, 11, 12, who can become embroiled in our criminal justice system, is not only counterproductive in the sense that it actually increases criminality over the long term, but I strongly believe that it breaches the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, and that we treat our children in the criminal justice system in this country in a way that is inhumane and contrary, therefore, to international law. And we must do something radically different and stop criminalising children. And what it all comes down to in the end, in my analysis, and it may be that this is something upon which Jonathan and I can agree, we'll find out in a moment, is that my end conclusion was that the biggest mistake we make is in categorising people as either good or evil, rather than looking at why acts are committed and what can be done in the long term to reduce the amount of crime in our society. By having this binary analysis of individuals as either good people or bad people, good people are the rest of us, the ones who read the newspapers and read the headlines, and bad people are the ones who commit crimes that should be in prison. We contribute to the never-ending cycle of criminality by a certain group of people, most of whom have been severely damaged in their childhood and severely damaged by addiction and mental health problems, and most of whom are not intrinsically any different in substance to the rest of us. So I think if we get away from the binary of good and evil, and we start to look at criminal justice policy in pragmatic terms, what works and what doesn't work, that's the way we need to radically reform our system. And that's what we're doing so badly at the moment. And that's why, as it says on the screen behind me, almost everything we do and think about crime and punishment is wrong.
Thank you, Chris Daw. Thank you very much. I have to say, can I throw in one quick question here? Is that okay with you? You talk about the business, the origins of prison being in notions of vengeance and notions of punishment, which are absolutely seem to be hardwired into the human psyche. And so what we have is a society which needs to speak to itself and to deal with itself. You know, sometimes one's the parent, sometimes one's the child. We need that. It's very difficult, isn't it, to take that out of politics, because politics is the only outlet we have for democracy. You know, whether we like them or not, our politicians are the ones we elected. And it seems to me that you can only really take the vengeance and the punishment sense out of it and think in terms of improvement and moving on, all the wonderful things you suggest in your book, which I hope we'll come to later. You can only really do that if you take one step slightly back from democracy, can't you? Because you need a prison policy which is non-political, because political prison policies are always a disaster. Is that what I read from your writing?
Yeah, I mean, that's in essence, the problem is democracy, which of course is, you know, often the refrain of those who have particularly controversial or unpopular ideas, because I fully accept that much of what I say, particularly the advocacy around massive reduction in the use of imprisonment, the decriminalisation, legalisation and licensing of drugs, these are things that are not broadly popular with the voting public. And of course, politicians know that. And that's why we had Priti Patel and Boris Johnson at the last election, very, very strongly campaigning for increasing the use of prison, reducing the amount of remission and license time that people will be given at the end of their sentences, and coming out very strongly against any liberalisation of drug policy. So people on the whole vote for very simple messages. And when Michael Howard said prison works, and when politicians say lock them up, these sentences are too short, the judges are too soft, sadly, from my point of view, the general public largely are much more attracted to that message than the one that I'm promoting. And that's why we have this ratchet effect, and the use of criminalisation and imprisonment goes up and up. And so it's a tragic, it's one of those cases where democracy, in my view, doesn't really work, much as it doesn't work, for example, for the death penalty, which is overwhelmingly popular. But of course, it was abolished by Parliament, probably against the popular will. But I don't think we're going to see that happening anytime soon with some of the things that I propose.
So either way, the death penalty and total reform, both of them are unpopular with public, or unpopular with the democratic system. Let's turn now to the Reverend Jonathan Aitken, and hear you, please.
Thank you, Libby. Well, I begin by saying that I'm a fan of Christor, or at least some of Christor. I reviewed his book for a weekly magazine and gave it what I hope he felt was a pretty favorable and enthusiastic review, because it's a very original contribution to the debate we're having about, which is really whether the future of criminal justice. But while I was reading the book, and I put this in my review, out of the attic of my memory tumbled an ancient joke from politics, which was when the Conservative Research Department back in the 50s at full throttle, and two of its most brilliant young men, both of whom achieved great fame. One was Ian MacLeod, who became Chancellor Exchequer, and the other was Enoch Powell, whose name still means a lot to a lot of people. And at one point, Enoch was saying some controversial view or other, and Ian MacLeod quipped. He said, "I'm a fellow traveller with Enoch, but I like to get off one or two stops before the train crashes into the buffers at the terminus." And this is exactly what I feel about Chris Daw's presentation tonight and some of his book. I'll come back to the things I want to praise. But in terms of things I think I should criticize, first of all, he's sort of given the vague impression that the whole system is sort of rotten to the core. And I really think that's wrong. Some of you, starting out your careers as young barristers. I was once a member of the Inner Temple. I decided not to go on with it, but nevertheless, I have always followed the careers of barristers. I think there are a lot of things we should praise about the legal system, especially when you look at other countries. I mean, we tend to look up to the great United States, but the USA, those of you who might be prosecutors one day, you're never going to run for election as district attorneys do. You're never going to indulge in almost semi-corrupt plea bargaining. You're never going to have the kind of mega sentences we've just never heard of in this country. A lot of things in our system are much better than many other places. Chris, in his book, argues very eloquently and well that places like Scandinavia, there are some good reforms which we could adopt. But don't think, please, at the beginning of this debate, that we're debating a totally rotten system. We're not. There are a lot of good things in it. And one of the things that's good about it, it actually does reform itself a bit. Now, when I was your age as students, unbelievably, adult consenting males indulging in sex in private were still being jailed. And that was abolished by reform. The death penalty, when I started out as a Tory candidate, I used to have trouble saying to audiences, I don't think the death penalty is right. I was booed off the platform once or twice. But actually, the reform came. So don't give up about some of these reforms. And one of the ones I think will happen in your lifetime, maybe not mine, is I think there'll be massive drug law reform. And we'll come back to that in a minute. But I think where we go wrong a bit with Chris is that there was a rather flamboyant sentence he's given a bit flamboyant sentence. I think I heard him say, almost across the board, the whole system is unfit for purpose and it achieves almost nothing. Well, now I haven't got soft on crime just because I was once in prison. I have a lot of sympathy with individuals in the system. My day job, unpaid, alas, is that I go into Penrith prisons most days and see people. But to say that it's unfit for purpose, here are two purposes it's absolutely fit for, whether we like it or not. There are some people in jails who the general public do need to be protected from. I've met a lot of them. And I just know that there are some people who have extraordinary evil. I don't have strength in that word. But if you think of child molesters and murderers on a big scale, men of dangerous violence, the public need to protect it. So the protection of the public is one good purpose for prison. The second one, I'm old-fashioned enough to say, well, some people actually do need to be punished. The state does need to have a system where it has some punishments. It may not always be imprisonment. I agree, we send far too many people to prison. But that's a purpose which is fulfilled. Purpose which is very badly fulfilled, well, not entirely a failure, is very badly, is the third purpose, which our Victorian ancestors would have been big on all along, was the rehabilitation of prisoners. And there we fail as a society extremely badly. And those of you starting up, please put your energy partly into the rehabilitation offenders. We're getting better at it. We're not very good at it. And one of the most sad statistics of the whole criminal justice system, roughly speaking, out of every 10 people who walk out of a prison, 6 or 7 of them go back within 2 or 3 years because they've not been rehabilitated. Not entirely their fault, sometimes it is, but we fail badly on the rehabilitation of prisoners. Now, should we be keen on reform? You bet we should be, because our jails are getting full and fuller by the day. Just as an aside almost, but one of the most heartbreaking parts of my job right now goes around a phrase which you will have heard in your lectures: justice delayed is justice denied. People parrot that off in the high legal echelons. But boy, if you see it on the wings right now because of our big prisons, thanks partly to COVID, but partly because the whole system is clogging up anyway. But there are people who, this time last year, they were arrested and charged. They got a trial within 3 months. They're now lucky if they get a trial within a year, and sometimes 18 months, 2 years. And the heartbreak that gives you means that the system is really letting them down badly. It's not entirely anybody's fault at the moment because COVID has produced all kinds of problems. But I don't see solutions to this huge, agonizing, personally heartbreaking backlog of effects of justice delayed, justice denied. I could go on with things that I think are troublesome in the criminal justice system, good about the criminal justice system. I do think our courts, our juries, our judges are fair. It's not a corrupt system. Actually, a lot of good probation officers, good prison officers, not all that bad. But there are big, big failures. And let me now go to a place where I really agree with Chris. And this isn't popular, what I'm saying. And by the way, of the 3 things I was mentioned at the beginning, I'm an ex-prisoner, I'm an ex-politician. But on being an ex-politician is not a bad thing. That you have to carry democracy with it. Chris seemed to be rather anti-democracy. I'm for democracy because I think you should persuade people. That's what being in a democratic country means. And more debates like this we have, the better. And I would like to persuade people, and Chris would like to persuade people, that our drug laws really are in a rotten, lousy shape, and we could do them much, much better. Now, I'm really an old recidivist on the subject of drug offenders. None of you will remember it, but back in 1967, there was a sensation when a full-page advertisement appeared in the Times, signed by people like the Beatles, and it said that the marijuana, small quantities, should be legalized. Well, it set off fireworks. Nearly destroyed my own political career as a young Tory candidate. But actually, it was right. And I think to a large extent, possession for small quantities of marijuana, at least, is now hardly a criminal offense. But come to the big stuff, I think Chris has got it right. That instead of this mega criminalized system, we actually need a careful, certainly a legal system to do with drugs, penalizing people in various ways, licensing quantities of drugs, but without going into huge detail, of which there is not time. I think one place I can agree with Chris is that our drug laws are not fit for purpose and need a huge and massive and courageous reform. It's not getting it. To wind up, the criminal justice system is much more of a patchwork quilt of good things and bad things about it. Chris's rather one-dimensional presentation, and I call it that, has done, but he's selling books. And it's a good book, and we should all read this book because it's really stimulating and first class. But at the end of the day, to fix the criminal justice is partly broke, and it needs a lot of fixing. But don't throw every bit of the baby out with the bathwater. It's a good debate we're having tonight, but there are many good ideas. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, Jonathan. Can I chuck in a question here to you? Because as a Christian and a minister now, and somebody of strong belief, you deal with a lot of good people as well as the people who have moral difficulties that you meet in prison. Do you believe that the electorate, the democratic will, on whom in the end any reform is simply going to depend, do you believe that people are persuadable that prisons should be changed, that prisons should be better, should be the kind of educative, rehabilitative, good reforming prisons which you and I and a lot of people think of? Do you think people can be persuaded? I mean, it is a moral and a Christian argument, isn't it?
Well, there are no votes in prisons or prisoners, so it can be quite a tough sell. I'm with you on that. However, just as the two examples I gave were reformed by the democratic process, let me give you one somewhat encouraging sign. A lot of polls around which say something like this. We are actually, the public, are not that in favor of so many prison sentences being handed out. But on the other hand, maybe there should be, because the alternatives to imprisonment are so feeble, ineffective, as they are in many cases. The probation system is creaking at the streams. About a year or two ago, a young prisons minister was kind enough to come and say me on the day he was appointed. I said, what do you do? I said, the first thing you should do, just take your government car on your first weekend and go round and drive around all the places where they say they are probation service and the system is monitoring offenders outside prison, and you will be stunned. Boy, he was. A third of them weren't turning up at all. Then what useful tasks were they doing? So until we have an effective alternatives to prison, I think the public, I can understand why they don't jump for joy when they say send less people to prison, but still go on having an effective system. So the focus on alternatives for prison, punishing alternatives to prison in many cases, is an area which needs reform.
We've got some, for later on, we've got some cracking questions, I have to say, from, as it were, the floor, the kind of national floor, wherever everybody is. But I'd just like to return to Chris Daw again with that point about alternatives, because you didn't speak much about that at the beginning, but in your book, the alternatives excited me a great deal, because I'm somebody who goes into the odd prison and, you know, I'm glad to see a good rehabilitative prison and sorry to see a bad prison, but I've always thought in terms of let's make the prisons better. You really come to a point of saying, actually, let's pull them down. Let's create something quite different. Can you give us, Chris Daw, just a very quick sketch of what an alternative might be? Are we talking Norway? Are we talking beyond Norway? How would it be?
I think it's beyond Norway, and I think, I mean, Jonathan made some excellent points. I mean, there obviously, if you had a Venn diagram of our positions, you know, there would be a significant intersection of agreement. And one of the points that Jonathan was making was that there is this residual group of people who are violent and dangerous, whether they be sexual offenders or violent in other ways. But they represent a very small proportion of the total 82 or so thousand prison population. Of which only 69% are non-violent. So 69% of all of those in prison did not commit a violent act to get there. Many of those were drug offenders, of course, a very large number of them are drug offenders. But that's the reality. So that residual group of maybe 15 or so or 20%, it's difficult to be precise. But that number is relatively small across the 80-odd thousand that we currently have in prison. And there may be reasons why some others would need to be in prison anyway. But even if you just drill down to that residual violent group from whom the public needs protection, the question you asked, Libby, is a good one. So what do you do with them? What do you do with people who, if you let them on the street, might indeed attack someone physically or sexually or otherwise in a violent act? And my position on it is that there is only really one form of criminal justice process for the most serious offenders that works, and that is to normalize their life in a custodial environment. So the reason why we have such high levels of recidivism when people leave prison, the great majority of people, is that they come from an utterly alien environment and have no coping mechanisms for the world that faces them on the outside. So my solution, which I describe in more detail in the book, is yes, you have to have a perimeter to contain certain individuals. You don't have to have a 50-foot high Victorian red brick wall or a massive concrete wall. There are all manner of ways in which perimeters can be less obvious. But for people inside, you need to normalize their existence so that when they walk out of the door or the gate to the outside world, it's actually not that different to what they've left behind. So you still protected the public from them because you've kept them contained, which Norwegian prisons largely do. Although, again, you know, the Norwegian model is not perfect, but Norwegian prisons normalize the existence of prisoners. They allow, for example, families to come in sometimes to spend the weekend. They allow much freer access of people to education and work and the sorts of things that people are going to have to do if they're ever going to get out of that revolving door of criminal justice. At the moment, the prisons that we have now in Britain and overwhelmingly more in America, Jonathan's absolutely right, the American system is off the chart worse than ours. 2.3, 2.4 million people in prison as against our 80-odd thousand. Of course, it's far worse. But those prisons in the UK and the US, where those large traditional institutions, all they do is have a revolving door so that people keep going back into them. And we just need to break that cycle. And that's how I see we do it. But let people live in ordinary living conditions, live their lives, study, work, and engage with their families in secure conditions as normally as possible. That, in my view, in the end, is what will reduce recidivism and reduce crime in our society.
And you do suggest in your book, and there's more detail, as you say, in the book, which everyone should read, tracking technology is one of the ways that we can do this, because it is possible to know where anybody is at any given moment. All this technology has come on far enough, you say, for that to be reason?
It has. It's very interesting, because when I made a series for the BBC last year, I filmed some of this technology, much of which originates in China. And it is, of course, for the general public, it's incredibly frightening because they can use facial recognition, they can use all manner of tracking to track entire towns and cities at once, to know exactly where anybody is all the time. Now, that would be awful to apply to a society as they are in some parts of China. But when you think about the alternative between being in the sorts of prison where Jonathan works and the sorts of prisons that we have in, you know, Strangeways and all of these large Victorian institutions, compare being in there on a wing with the clanging gates that you described earlier, with having to carry a phone, having to have a facial recognition system in your house to make sure you're there and you're not leaving. What would people rather choose? Would you rather be in prison as we know it, or virtually imprisoned in your own home, able to go to work? Because, again, with facial recognition and iris scanning and all of this technology, you can make sure that people are where they say they will be. A judge, for example, concerned about whether someone will stick to his sentence. We're on the system now, Libby. There's no reason a judge can't say, well, I want to see Joe Bloggs next week at 3 o'clock in his house or at his place of work. And I will log in and I'll deal with 10 or 12 people that I've sentenced. I'll speak to them all, rather than waiting for them to fail, breaching them, bringing them back into court and sending them back to prison, which is what we do now. So we can use technology in a really creative way that actually makes things fairer and better for the individual, but most importantly of all, improves the outcomes, because that's what really matters, is that they don't reoffend and they don't go back to prison. That matters more than anything to the whole of our society.
Jonathan, coming back to you, can you imagine that? Can you imagine, Jonathan Aitken, can you imagine this virtual tracking being a replacement for, at least certainly for the most non-violent offenders? Would that be something you'd welcome? Yes.
I mean, I again get off 1 or 2 stops before the train crashes into the buses of the terminus with Geoffrey, but with Chris. But nevertheless, I do think that we could go an awful long way with new technology to get some of the improvements that he's really aiming for. And I couldn't agree more that, you know, just banging people up for long hours and long waits, and there was no rehabilitation at all. Of course, if you had the right kind of technology, you would get and proper forms of rehabilitation. It would be a big improvement. One of my jobs in government was to be somebody called Chief Secretary to the Treasury, and he's the cabinet minister who deals with the money. And we can't just leave money out of this. Some of these reforms Chris is talking about, amazing though it sounds, is very, very expensive. And the Treasurer, the Cerberus of all public spending, says, well, show us something that works. And a lot of these things have to be tested for some time before they work. And quite a few of them don't work very well. I could bang on for hours which reforms might work, which might. But I rather enjoy the concept of the Venn diagram. I think Chris and I, he was the Home Secretary and I was the Chief Secretary of the Treasury. We could probably work out a few good reforms together without going all the way.
It's a highly probable scenario, Jonathan. I think, frankly, either of us will ever be in one of those positions in the future.
Shall we move? We're getting some very interesting questions through. Can I start tossing those out, and either of you can leap up and reply to them? The first one is a very topical one. I think we should maybe come to something topical first, which is: do you think that the bar for bail for those on remand ought to be lowered in the light of the COVID pandemic, given that people on remand have not been convicted of any crime? They're at higher risk of the general population of contracting COVID because they are in prison, and that maybe the bar should be lowered there. I mean, should we be making massive changes straight away because of what is happening under COVID?
Well, I'm happy to have a go at that. So it's a nuanced question, or rather the answer is, because one of the things that I mean, Jonathan rightly described, these enormous delays, which of course mean that people are spending a very long period in custody awaiting trial. But the other side of that coin, and it's something that I've been directly involved in advising the victims of crime, is that victims, particularly victims of serious violence and rape, for example, are having to wait for years and years, and they are sadly often seeing their attacker released on bail for exactly that reason. Now, of course, that person is an alleged attacker, at least in the eyes of the legal system, until convicted. But to a victim who knows what happened to them, they are seeing people not getting to a speedy trial and a resolution of the case, and potentially a lengthy sentence of imprisonment for a dangerous individual, but they're seeing them out on the streets. And I have women clients living in virtual house arrest in fear of walking the streets because people are being released from custody early as a result of COVID delays. So I think it's not as simple a point as perhaps the question implies, because there are two sides to the coin. But we have far too many people on remand, and one of the reasons for that is because we have virtually nowhere else for them to go. That the provision of bail hostels, or effective and decent places, bail hostels, or other forms of monitoring for people who are awaiting trial, are so badly resourced and so poor that they almost inevitably lead to people breaching their bail and being locked up. So it's all part of that kind of overall systemic failure to invest in what works, and thereby everything in the end being back to put people in prison. And so yes, we should be back, but unfortunately there's been such a lack of investment. We have so few alternatives to remand for many prisoners.
Jonathan, yes?
Well, on bail, I think we should start by reminding everyone that there is a presumption of an entitlement to bail in our system. But as a prison chaplain, one of my jobs is to visit the new arrivals. And time and again, I go around that day's admissions to the prison, and I often meet astonishingly young people who seem to be pretty harmless. And I said, well, why are you in here? And the answer is, as often as not, they've been in some sort of street crime where maybe even a knifing has taken place. Police have rounded up the whole darn lot of them. And then they ask them what they did and then what their address is. If you have no clear abode, no fixed abode, or when the police telephone, it doesn't turn out to be the right address, you pretty well automatically get banged up in whichever prison is nearest to you. And getting out of that is quite difficult. Now, I don't know what the magic solution is here. The police are doing the right thing. It just takes time. But I'm constantly passing messages to families and first of all, letting them know where they are. And secondly, so the criminal justice time and again is flawed quite badly in sort of very practical ways. But what's the solution if somebody has no address?
You see, these are very good points, and I'll tell you one of the reasons why we have these problems, apart from the lack of, homelessness, of course, and addiction, and many of the reasons why people are not a very good bail candidate on the surface, but also you can't ignore, from a lawyer's point of view, the enormous cuts to the legal aid budget, which mean that is almost no resource for lawyers to advocate for these people who are initially locked up in a police station. The payments for attendances at police station by solicitors and the payments for attending at the early court hearings where bail is decided have been cut so much that lawyers are doing dozens of cases sometimes on a weekend, and they just don't have the time or the resource to be able to properly investigate the circumstances of the client and to look for options which would avoid them having to go to custody. And often there just aren't any options because of the lack of investment I described earlier. So it all links together. If you don't resource the system properly, what you end up with, as in Jonathan's previous role as Chief Secretary of the Treasury, actually you end up with people costing the state tens of thousands a year to be in custody, when a few thousand a year would be enough to provide the resource, if it was there in the first place, to avoid them being there at all.
Can I just come back briefly to you, Chris, because there's another question here, there's a couple of questions here about whether more vocational and educational opportunities within prisons would help reduce recidivism, which I think is what we all kind of hope and think every time we go to a prison where it's happening. But then you talk about maybe people in their own homes, people being monitored in their own homes. A lot of people in prisons go back to the most atrocious homes where they're not going to get vocational and education. They might actually be better off in a learning to be a mechanic in a prison training shop, or learning to read in a prison training shop. Less likely to happen in their appalling environments. I mean, how are you going to square that circle when we know that a lot of the people in prison are from absolutely dreadful homes or none at all?
Well, I describe in the book, although I don't use his real name, I call him Michael in the book, but I describe a client of mine who had been in custody, I think pretty much 30 years of his, he was 52, and he'd been in prison for 30 years, and he hadn't ever done anything that bad. He just kept going back in again, and it was longer and longer, and I described the ridiculous crime that ended up getting him locked away for a long time, of doing a robbery in a pub with a banana in his pocket, pretending it was a gun after he'd only been out of prison for a few days. And back in again he went for a long sentence. And the conversation that I had with him was, and I described, the whole encounter in the book, is he said, I just, in here, I know where I am. Out there, I just don't have it. I don't know what to do. I don't know how to survive in a society. I am more comfortable. I know where everything is. I know how the system works, and this is where I kind of feel at home. And what does that say, Libby? What does that say about us as a society
in general? But then let me very, very quickly chuck at you, because I'd like to throw this one at Jonathan as well. This is a sort of coda to one of those questions about recidivism. Would it be better if we had far, far more and far, far smaller prisons? Do we need a lot of little units? Can you see what you think about that? Then we'll see what Jonathan takes of that.
Well, sorry, I don't, were you asking me, Libby? I couldn't.
Yeah, so let's come to you first, because you've talked about people going out to their own homes and being monitored. I'm wondering whether small prison, smaller units.
I don't think calling them prison and calling them units is the problem. That's why one of my chapters is called Why We Should Close All the Prisons. I don't think having more things called prisons and more custodial institutions, whether they're big or small, is the answer. The answer to the lack of accommodation for those with drug problems and homeless people is systemic investment in housing, particularly in our urban environments, and general improvement of the living conditions in many communities where living conditions are so poor, and from whom overwhelmingly the prison population is drawn. And that's not a criminal justice policy. That's a rational policy in society. If you're going to have incredibly poor living conditions in high crime areas, those areas are going to continue to be high crime areas, and all of the problems we're talking about are going to continue. So housing is a major issue in our society. Homelessness is a major issue in our society, and those two things need to be addressed.
Jonathan, can I turn to you about the idea of prison education, and also whether more and smaller prisons would reduce recidivism? You visit a lot of prisons, a lot of prisoners.
Well, more prison education, absolutely, yes. We spend a tiny percentage of the prison budget on prison education, and ministers get up, so it's gone up 50% this year, whatever it is. It's actually gone from such a small base. It's tiny, and still a staggering percentage of prisoners cannot read or write adequately. And you might ask yourself, well, if somebody can't read the letters on a label, how are they going to get a job in our society? So more educational vocation course, absolutely yes. Local and smaller prisons, up to a point, yes. Pentonville is actually called a local prison. Not a very small one. We have 1,300 prisoners right now. We've only got about 1,000. But we actually do a little bit better in some areas because there is a sense of local community around Islington, Canning Town, Camden, and so on. And because people have got roots and connections. And I don't believe in building great mega jails off on the Isle of Wight or Anglesey, wherever it is. I think prisons should be close to communities. But I think we just get back here and time again to money. Whether we're talking about young barristers being appallingly badly remunerated for getting their what used to be called doc briefs, but are now called it's illegal aid. Of course, that's a disgrace. But if you're the chief secretary of the Treasury, whoever the poor guy is right now, you've got people from the NHS chanting that they need more ventilators. And you say, oh, well, excuse me, I actually need some money for more bail hostels. You lose these kind of battles inside cabinet committees or on the floor of the House of Commons. So what needs, criminal justice has rather poor advocates in the theatre of public life. This is why Chris is such a welcome breath of fresh air. We ought to be arguing about these, but there are not many of us who are actually really interested. And if you're a rising young MP, you don't make a reputation in arguing for better fees for barristers in doing legal aid cases. It ought to be, but there's a huge money issue behind all these things, in competing priorities. And time and again, a lot of things we're talking about lose.
Here's a snappy question from a magistrate who says, I'm naturally concerned about the revolving doors of prisons. However, my colleagues and I are generally bound by sentencing guidelines. Change can only come from the top. But what, Chris Daw, would you suggest in the meantime by both senior judiciary, government, and by lowly magistrates? In other words, there are sentencing guidelines and they feel trapped by these. It's maybe
and they are trapped by them, and the observation is an entirely accurate one, because both on the other side of the Atlantic and in the United Kingdom, over the last 20 or 30 years, we have seen the introduction of guidelines, minimum sentences, and guidelines becoming stricter and stricter in their application. Particularly, one of my kind of hobby horses, as you know, is drug policy. Well, the drug sentencing guidelines places the sentences for certain kinds of drug offences way beyond the sentences for rape, for example, which people may or may not agree with or realise. But your magistrate is right that the sentencing guidelines come directly as a result of the clamour of public opinion. Whenever there is a particular kind of type of criminal case in the news, whether it's a driving case, suddenly someone's been killed by a drunk driver, so let's increase all the sentences and all the guidelines for drunk driving. Or we introduce a whole new crime of causing death by careless driving a few years ago, which has led to people being imprisoned for careless driving because of the fact that someone was killed as a result of an accident that took place, when in the past careless driving was punishable only by penalty point. And now, if it's careless driving with a death cause, you go to prison for years. And so these guidelines have come into place and new crimes have been created, and the courts have to do their job, and magistrates and judges have to apply these guidelines in a way that didn't happen when I started out in my career. You could persuade a judge that the right thing to do in a particular case was not to send an individual to prison because there are a whole range of good reasons not to do so. Now the judge sits there and says, yes, but look at box A2 on the sentencing guideline. It says I have to start from 5 years. How can I possibly depart from this, and your magistrate will be in the same position, and every judge sitting in the Crown Court is in the same position. And sentencing guidelines are intended to standardise across the country. What they do is they ratchet the sentences up and up and up, and they remove the discretion of judges and magistrates to address the merits of an individual case. And for me, sentencing guidelines and minimum sentences are an abomination, and we should never have gone down that route. And it's one of the major reasons why our prisons are overcrowded and full of people who shouldn't be there.
So there is a sort of practical and immediate political point and something to fight for.
Let me just say a word. As a
sure.
magistrate, I think it's important to say, thank goodness for our magistrates, without whom the criminal justice system couldn't function. Everything Chris has said, I would perhaps leave out the word abomination, but nevertheless, the sentencing guidelines are far too rigid. And my mother used to be a magistrate in Suffolk in the days when absolutely magistrates had a lot of discretion about who they did or did not send, often with some good local wisdom from probation officers or the WRBS. And I think they did a lot better than when you've got to turn up what Chris calls as rule books. Clause A2 said you've got to send into prison for 6 months. I think it's an area reform is badly needed.
Yeah, can I make a point about that? Sorry, just briefly, which is that Jonathan made a good point earlier, which was to say that those who operate in our system do so with enormous integrity and a sense of fairness on the whole. So whether it's judges, magistrates, jurors, or the lawyers who are involved in the case, we're all doing our job. My point wasn't that the people are intrinsically bad or in doing things that are intrinsically wrong. My point is that the system is set up in a way that the outcomes are bad. So however good the intentions of your magistrate, if he or she is forced to send someone to prison who doesn't belong there by a guideline, that's not the magistrate's fault. That's systemic failure policy. That's my point. We have really good, honest, hard-working people in our criminal justice system in every single role, from probation all right across the piece, prison officers everywhere, police officers. But you can only do the job if the system itself is intrinsically sensible, rational, pragmatic, and aimed at the right objectives. And at the moment it isn't. And that's not the fault of those who are in the system.
So we've got a lot of interesting questions here, and some of them are very, very specific about drugs, specific about LGBT, about trans prisoners, about race and so on. We may be able to come to that. But here is one which fascinated me and I'd like to put an extra spin on. Somebody says, should there be a more intense focus on rehabilitating young offenders? And I would ask, maybe first Jonathan, then Chris, is this a good idea that we should look at the young offenders far more intensely, even if it's at the expense of some of the older prisoners who just are the sad ones like Michael, who Chris has just described? I mean, Jonathan, do you think that if we were to focus much, much harder on rehabilitating young offenders, throw everything at that would be the best track? I
entirely agree with that. And there is actually, I think this is more a job for better funded, maybe by the state, charities than the criminal justice system itself. Because I do a bit of mentoring and I fail sometimes very badly and succeed sometimes rather joyfully. But the more people from the outside get involved in the rehabilitation, and I think we don't need a whole lot of paid officials by the state. You need better funded charities in the rehabilitation field. And I, for example, and I'm sure there are many other examples, but I happen to be the honorary president of a Yorkshire charity founded by two very tough-looking prison officers who said we absolutely want to get out of this and get into rehabilitation. It's called Tempest Nova. And last year we had 350 prisoners who came out of jails and into jobs. This charity has done a stunning job. And there are good charities around. And I don't think the state should dole out the money and help and encourage. But the rehabilitation of young offenders, yes, absolutely, give it priority. The younger the better, that's the best chance. Get them into jobs. Prisoners do not, on the whole, reoffend all that much once they're in a job.
And if, Chris, it was to be rather at the expense of some of the things we do for older and long-term prisoners, is that fair?
I think, spoiler alert for the book, but I came to the conclusion that the one thing that you could do to improve the long-term outcomes of our criminal justice system would be to take children and young people out of it altogether, as they do in Luxembourg and a very small number of other countries, where if you're under the age of majority, in the society in which you live, you are deemed incapable of committing crime. You can, of course, be required to be detained in some way, shape or form in an educational institution, a secure one if you're very dangerous. But to designate, as we still do in this country, a 10-year-old child as a criminal capable of committing a criminal act. I mean, I have a 9-year-old daughter, I've had children of 10. The idea that they are capable of understanding with the same level of appreciation as an adult the nature of criminality and the acts that they commit is absolutely ridiculous. I mean, it's so contrary to everything we know about children. Never mind younger people, older younger people in their late teens and early 20s who are still developing. And so what we must do is we must, as a priority, stop criminalizing children, because you may as well, if you take a 12 or 13-year-old, it's more realistic to be going into the criminal justice system for the first time. If you take them into a court, you find them guilty of a crime and you punish them as a criminal, you may as well tattoo criminal on their head, because that's how they'll feel and that's how they'll behave in the great majority of cases. And so we're doing that now. We've done it for far too long. We used to hang 8-year-olds. I talk about that in the book. We used to hang 8-year-olds in the Victorian era for theft. Now we don't do that anymore, but we still call children serious criminals, and we still lock many of them up in institutions that look like prisons. And we just can't do that. If we carry on doing that, we will carry on perpetuating the system that we've got now.
There's an interesting question here, a kind of what the hell do we do question. How could aspiring politicians and lawyers, and obviously a lot of lawyers do end up in politics, how can aspiring politicians and lawyers actually help to bring about reform to the entire approach to prisons? All these worthy things that we're saying and that we're all broadly agreeing on, even if some get off the train a bit earlier than others. What the hell are we going to do? I mean, write letters, vote. There's usually nobody to vote for who would vote for complete reform. What do you each think should be possible for the individuals to do?
Well,
I think that's a really
hang
good
on.
point.
Let me strike a note of optimism here, because I think Chris in his book is a bit of an over-tough politician basher. It is, of course, true there are some pretty grim politicians around, and I've never actually heard anyone say, lock them up and throw away the key, but there is a mentality on both sides of the House of Commons there, and it gets cheap applause. But actually, if you look seriously at House of Commons debates and the Justice Committee and criminal justice, there's a lot of quite thoughtful, quite wise, moderate in both senses of the word, politicians who do try and take an interest. One of the things that's gone wrong about it is that the Ministry of Justice, which I would love to be Secretary of State for Justice, but if I was a young politician, but it's now regarded as a sort of bit of a graveyard, and you should stay there as short as possible. And we have something absolutely astonishing, like 6 Secretaries of State for Justice in 7 years. They don't have time to find out where the paperclips are before they're moved on. And if you could get a reforming Justice Secretary, I mean, Michael Gove, when he came in, lasted about 6 months, but during those 6 months, he came up with some very good ideas. If he'd seen them through with the political determination that a heavyweight cabinet minister can show, build a constitution, you could get a lot of reforms done, but there are some great flaws in the ministerial system of criminal justice reform.
Yeah, I'll give you, I think there's a very simple answer to the question, is that the only thing you can do is try and move the dial of public opinion. Because Jonathan spoke at the beginning about some of the antiquated laws that we had, which were incredibly discriminatory and cruel to LGBT people. We've only recently seen gay marriage in its fullest sense becoming lawful in this country. Why did those things happen, which at one time would have been unthinkable as a matter of British policy and public opinion, as Jonathan said? Because someone the advocacy of organizations and individuals move the dial of public opinion. And so my view is we have social media. So I've been fortunate enough to be given the voice and a platform through publishing a book for a major publisher, making television programs for the BBC. So I can reach many people. But everyone can reach people via social media. You know, Twitter is a powerful tool. There are so many different platforms now that people can actually give their opinion and try to move other people to change their opinion. But, you know, there is no substitute for moving the dial of public opinion. If you start to tilt it just enough, you can perhaps start to get to a tipping point where politicians are prepared to take a risk. At the moment, it's just too risky for them.
There's almost an answer here in the next question, actually, because it's about offenders trying to seek work after finishing their sentence and how difficult it can be. And of course, there are employers like Timpson's, you know, who make a point of taking on people with a record. I mean, that again is part of it. If people, I mean, I've heard conversations and joined in conversations at Timpson things where people are actually just genuinely delighted that here is somebody who's got a decent job. I mean, that's a good part of it, isn't it? And that, Jonathan's another, and preaching to the employers is another vital thing. Perhaps you should be doing too.
Well, it is a very big part of it, and I think we are making some progress. More and more employers are actually willing to give second chances. And one of the more disgraceful aspects of this is it used to be, and it still is, an almost universal form, which anybody applying for a job had to put a tick or a cross in the book. Have you ever had a criminal record? And I remember going to see David Cameron about this and saying, when he was all in favor of rehabilitation, saying, who's the greatest discriminator of all? Her Majesty's government and its various agencies. They all have this box. And there was then a campaign called Ban the Box. There's no need to ask anybody whether or not they've got a criminal record. Ask them at the interview. And I mean, one of my campaigns is not necessarily to give everybody jobs, but to give everybody interviews. Because so many of these young men actually do come across, especially that have the vaguest bit of interview experience. So it is getting better, and Timpson's is an outstanding example, but there are a lot of other firms which are now quietly, they don't boast about it, but they do actually give second chances to people with criminal records if they interview well.
This is a very interesting point because one of the things that I think that the public are actually quite keen on is the idea of second chances and redemption. Yes. I think the public would see someone who actually does get out of prison and get a job and is working and paying taxes and perhaps contributing to their children in terms of paying for their children's needs and paying rent or mortgages. People would see that as being, I think, quite a valuable thing. And that, you know, Timpson's do it understandably because it has a positive halo effect on their business. And it's a shame actually that other businesses don't make more of it because the more you normalize the employment of ex-offenders, and indeed, you know, we need to massively reform the Rehabilitation of Offenders Act so that periods of rehabilitation are shorter, and so that particularly children who maybe have had a record before they were 18, that we delete those altogether, and they no longer form part of someone's life going forward. They can get this enormous weight that drags them back taken away. Just delete it and make it go away. There are exceptions to that, clearly for serious violence and sex offences and so on. But in many cases, you should just what they call expunge the record in America and just say, okay, you've reached the age of 18, you did this when you were 15 or 16, it's not something that poses an ongoing risk to the public, we just give you a clean slate at the age of 18. I think that will be really, really important reform.
Couple of questions about women's prisons and whether there are particular things which should be done, particular reforms which could be quickly made for women in prison. I gather there is at the moment a project to put beds for children and family visits within some women's prisons. I mean, do we have to, should women's prisons be treated almost in a completely different way to male prisons, given that there are fewer violent offenders there? I mean, is that a thing? There's 3 or 4 questions have suggested this.
It's not just that there are fewer violent offenders, it's that overwhelmingly the women in prison are either addicted, have serious mental health problems, or are the victims of abuse. much more so. I mean, there's a significant proportion of the male population, who prison population in that category, but very few women are not suffering from one of those three historical issues.
And yet you will sometimes, if you talk to women prisoners, as I quite often have done, they will quite often say, yeah, I'm quite glad it was a decent length of sentence, rehab on the Queen.
Not just rehab, but protection from domestic or other forms of violence. Many women in the women's prison estate are escaping the most horrific conditions of ongoing violence, including in the sex trade, for example, where they may be the victims of pimps and others who violently exploit them, and they see prison as a refuge from what is otherwise a quite horrendous life. But what that does, I mean, yes, we should treat women's prisons differently, not because they are women, but because the problems which they face are different ones and they require different solutions. And one of the things that perhaps the point I've just made identifies is, well, if we provide very poorly for women who are the victims of domestic and other forms of violence in our society. We provide very few refuges, and those that do exist are often extremely poorly funded. So we should be looking to divert women, and there's some amazing projects going on at the moment, particularly one in Hampshire by Lady Edwina Grosvenor, who's spent an enormous amount of her own money to open a residential facility to divert women from the prison estate. And so there are things out there, but there should be very few women in prison, because most of those who are in there at the moment don't belong.
To anyone going to the subject as seriously as they should, without the timeliness we have, there was a wonderful report about 20 years ago now, called the Corston Report. Jean Corston was an outstanding Labour backbencher when I was in Parliament. She's, I think, now a life peer, and she went an enormous step and produced a blueprint for reforming women's prisons, all the kind of things you're talking about. I think you'll find that Edwina Grosvenor's experiment is sort of inspired partly by the Corston Report. If we could only implement the Corston Report, we'd make a good improvement in the lot of women prisoners. But there are big problems, but they can be solved.
There's a moment, we're going to be running out of time soon, and I'm supposed to have summed up, but there's no way I can sum up all that we have talked about. But I would like to pick up on questions which have arisen and which seem very important to me, that take various angles, on radicalization, Islamist radicalization within prisons. There's a chapter, Chris, in your book on the death of Jack Merritt at London Bridge, who was killed by Usman Khan, who you point out had been in Whitemoor, a tough prison, warehoused, dehumanized, re-radicalized there, and who was tackled, among others, by two other prisoners off the education project that he was involved in, one of whom, at least I know, was at Warren Hill, which is a highly civilized prison, which I know quite well. There's a sense there, isn't there, Chris, that, I mean, it almost illustrated everything, didn't it? That the man who had come chiefly out of a really tough prison was the one who committed the crime, and the other, those who stopped him, those who actually stepped forward quite heroically, had been through better prisons. I mean, does that seems to tell a whole story, doesn't it?
Yes, and the reason I chose that particular case, not only because the events took place just as I was finishing the manuscript and coming towards the end of the book, and so it was highly topical, but the reason I chose that particular case was it seemed to me, and it's in the context of that good versus evil sort of binary choice, is that you had Usman Khan, who was the London Bridge killer of Jack Merritt and Saskia Jones. He had been sent to prison. He'd served 8 years of a 16-year sentence in Whitemoor, entirely in category A/B conditions, in high security conditions, in other words. But after 8 years, within a year of that 24-hour-a-day imprisonment in those conditions, he comes out and double. And many people were saying, well, why wasn't he in for 10 or 12 or 15 years? Instead of saying to themselves, as I do in the book, but hold on a minute, if you can't do anything with someone in 8 years, where you have them in your care and custody 24 hours a day, what makes you think you'll be able to do anything in 10 or 12 or 30 years? And so you're absolutely right, Libby, that those who then came to the aid of those young people, sadly unsuccessfully in their case, but no doubt potentially saved other people's lives, had been in prison for murder and very serious crimes, and yet they had somehow emerged through those institutions which were much more focused on rehabilitation, on education. One of them had got a degree while he was in prison and was doing very well in his rehabilitation. And it just showed you that they were prepared to risk their own lives to try to save the lives of people they didn't know. And that, for me, it summed up that whole, that whole binary choice as being completely flawed, because these were people who on one view were evil, but here they are committing the most selfless and decent acts to save others. And why is that? And why was one of them coming out of this one institution and becoming a double murderer almost within a year, and the others are actually self-sacrificial and behaving in that entirely decent and humane way? And that case, for me, sums up everything that's right and everything that's wrong with our system.
Now we've got just a couple of... Jonathan, yes?
Well, extremism and radicalization in prisons is a problem, but I'm a dove rather than a hawk on this problem. It exists. It's pretty small. When some people are making a kind of absolute mountain out of a mole, in my view, Muslim prisoners are not so hugely different from all other kinds of prisoners. We have very good relations with the Muslims in Pennville. I even like to preach in the mosque every so often. I don't know any other Anglican clergyman gets asked to do that. And we all get on. And the idea that there's a seething horde of sort of wild extremism, and I just think, it is not the big deal. And even if we go on thinking it's a big deal, it's still so small that, and you probably never stop some people who are crazy enough to want to come out and commit terrorist offences. So I would not get excited as the way some people do on this subject.
As we've got to sum up before we say the Treasurer comes to say goodbye to us all, I just want to ask each of you a quite quick question about each other. Jonathan, are you any closer to the station to which Chris has arrived? Are you still a reluctant fellow traveller, sort of hopping off at Watford? Or are you beginning to be converted to his idea of knocking out the entire concept of prison as prison?
I don't think honestly you can do that. I mean, I do believe punishment is sometimes by imprisonment for the protection of the public is right. But that said, I mean, this debate, very good-natured, well-informed debate, it shows Chris and I are not from some huge distance. One of the jokes about train stations, I mean, if he and I were in charge of the justice system, I think we'd agree on a good few reforms. And so I don't feel sort of estranged from Chris at all. I welcome his book, welcome him.
Chris, is there any point, unless we all get on the same train as you and try to have a root and branch reform of our whole approach from the democracy outwards?
Well, it's giving something away. Why did I choose such extreme titles for my chapters as Let's Close the Prisons? It wasn't because I think we're ever going to do that. It's by saying that you start to make people think that we're doing something completely wrong. And frankly, if we ended up somewhere between where we are now and my station, even if it was only halfway along, that would be an enormous victory for reform of criminal justice in our country. And I wouldn't be lying awake at night thinking, why didn't they, why haven't they come all the way to my station? I'd be more than happy for any progress on this issue, because frankly, we're seeing very little at the moment. And
all these young lawyers who have been absolutely deluging us with questions, a lot of them very detailed, so we couldn't really go into every single thing about trans or racial policy or so on. The hope is in them to some extent. The hope is in the young radical lawyer, the young, compassionate, human, decent lawyer.
I think so, and I don't want for a moment those young people who are embarking on the journey that I embarked on 25 years or so ago to be disheartened by anything I say, because as I made the point at the beginning, without doubt, the most fascinating careers that you could possibly follow. And I imagine possibly Jeffrey will agree with me after a much longer and more distinguished career. But it's a fascinating career, and absolutely you should pursue this career with every ounce of your being. But along the way, if you can use that which you experience every day to contribute to the debate, which may lead to change, I think that you will do your profession a great service.
Thank you, Jonathan Aitken and Chris Daw, both very much. I've been fascinated by this. At this point, I think I hand over to our Master Treasurer.
Libby, thank you so much. I'm trying to start my video, but the system is telling me I can't do that because the host stopped it. So, host, no, I've got the technology now. That should do it. Yes, hello.
You appeared as a very distinguished dot, may I say.
Gosh, what can I say? Let me start with Sir Geoffrey Nice, who presides over this social context of the law lecture series and who's been responsible for this particular topic and event. As Sir Geoffrey said in his opening remarks, these lectures tap into the knowledge and wisdom of the Inns of Court, and we saw that to maximum effect this evening. This was a topic on which we all have views, don't we? Geoffrey spent his evening not merely listening, but dropping me chat messages with his burning questions. One of those, which is very interesting, was whether we should not see the national population as a family and adopt the measures we would as parents to criminals in our society. And he asked me, as an example, how do families deal with a difficult child? And then he answered his question by saying, not by locking them in their rooms. But obviously, Geoffrey had a very different childhood to mine. We heard next, and throughout, from you, Libby. You are a class act. You made the job of moderator appear completely effortless. Those of us who've dabbled in this game know just how much is involved in taking all the questions that are thrown at you on chat, and then giving your own spin to it and rolling everything up together. We were very, very impressed by the way you presided over the discussion, and your vast experience in media was completely evident. Let me just add this, Libby. My heart lifts when I read your column in the Times. You have the joy, and you pass that on to all of us. It's not all bad news, and you tell us the good news. So thank you for that. And it's a privilege to be able to tell you that in person. Chris and Jonathan, well, what a vast privilege for us to have two people, not merely at the top of their careers, but with such rich experience, immersed in this. I mean, really immersed in it. And I jotted down to a comment each of you made. From Jonathan, you said quite early on, there are some people in prison the public needs to be protected from. I've met a lot of them. I mean, not many of us can speak our own experience like that. And then Chris, you said something, and this brings me back to Geoffrey's point about how we treat our own family. You said with young people in particular, you may as well tattoo criminal on their heads. And I'm sure every parent has thought this, has thought how easy it would be for our children to wander off the straight course. And once they do, how difficult it must be to get them back. And for me, that's the most important thing, just making sure that whatever we do in this country, that we just look after the young children. And if they wandered off the track, we put them back on it, because locking them up has never seemed to me to be a right way about things. Anyway, those are my thoughts. Your thoughts were all very much better, and we're very grateful to you for them. And I think we're just about out of time. Thank you very, very much indeed.
Thank you, Guy.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Everyone.
Thank you so much. That was absolute